and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I'm thrilled to be joined by Everjoy Grace Chiimba, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the University of Bonn in Germany. We're actually recording this podcast in person for a change, and that is because Everjoy has joined us for the last month at the Indian Ocean World Centre as a graduate research trainee. Everjoy holds a BA in Geography and Archaeology from the University of Zimbabwe and an MSc in the Geography of Environmental Risks and Human Security from the University of Bonn and the United Nations University. She's published research in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. In this podcast, we're going to discuss some of her work in progress that stems from her doctoral fieldwork in Eastern Zimbabwe, and which she presented at the Indian Ocean World Centre Speaker Series earlier during her stay here. The paper is entitled The Aftermath of Cyclone Idai, 2019, Youth Narratives Beyond Official and Online Discourses in Zimbabwe. Everjoy, thank you so much for joining us, joining me for this podcast and for joining us more broadly at the IWC. It's been great having you here. I'm going to start off just by asking you a very broad question. Could you basically provide us with some background? What was Cyclone Idai and how did it affect Zimbabwe?
Thank you, Philip, for having me and also for hosting me at the Indian Ocean World Centre for the past month. I've had a wonderful time and I hope that I will come back for another collaboration. But just to dive straight into my PhD topic, Cyclone Idai is an important event to look at because it was the most devastating cyclone ever to hit Zimbabwe, and it is classified as the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded in Southern Africa. But not only that, it was also classified as the second deadliest cyclone in the southwestern Indian Ocean. So it formed in early March 2019 over the warm waters of the Mozambican Channel before gaining strength and making landfall in Mozambique on the 14th of March. Here in Beira, it caused catastrophic flooding and loss of life and infrastructure. The storm then moved inland towards eastern Zimbabwe and also some parts of Malawi. But today I'll focus on Zimbabwe. So when Cyclone Idai reached Zimbabwe, on the night of March 15th, it brought heavy rains. The area received over 300 milliliters in less than 24 hours, which triggered flash floods and massive landslides in this area, which is a mountainous region. In Chimanimani alone, more than 300 people were confirmed dead and over 200 people were reported missing. Approximately 16,000 were displaced. And across Zimbabwe, more than 270,000 people were affected, with extensive damage to homes, schools, bridges, road networks, and also communication networks. In some parts, entire communities were cut off for days and communication infrastructure was disrupted, which affected rescue and relief operations in the aftermath of Cyclone Idai. But however, beyond this immediate tragedy and the high numbers of loss of life and infrastructural damage, Cyclone Idai exposed Zimbabwe's vulnerability to increased climate-related shocks and also reviewed a weak state of disaster preparedness generally in the country because the state of disaster preparedness did not sufficiently mitigate the impacts of the disaster. And in particular, the cyclone revealed serious gaps in disaster communication in rural areas because many warnings had been shared on social media. And I remember seeing a couple of warnings on Twitter 5 days before it made landfall from different international media houses such as BBC and CNA. This is how I actually got to know about the cyclone and many others online. But unfortunately, this did not translate to a timely warning for the communities in Chimanimani. And it did feel weird to me to have been more informed about the disaster than the people in the area. And even when the cyclone made landfall, global media coverage was largely focused on Mozambique. And of course, because this is where it first made landfall. But many Zimbabweans online, both at home and in the diaspora, began to debate about the absence of a timely warning in Chimanimani, which of course raised important questions about the government's role in disaster communication. And thus, as I followed the hashtag Cyclone Idai, I became intrigued by the diverse discussions, topics, and themes that emerged from the disaster discourse on Twitter, which is now called X. This is when I shifted my position from being an observer to a researcher. And these critical observations shaped the trajectory of my doctoral research, marking an online ethnographic study where I wanted to investigate why the early warning systems failed to reach the vulnerable communities and why people who were observing from a distance were actually more informed. And I wanted to understand what role mobile technologies actually played in this complex disaster communication landscape. The debates online raised important questions about how information is shared, who gets to share it, and whose experiences are made visible during disasters, given also the visibility of Mozambique and Zimbabwe at an international scale was quite different. By observing how Twitter discussions shaped public narratives and became a key space for many Zimbabweans to exchange and share information, also mobilizing aid for the people who were affected, I started to reflect more critically on the meaning and role of digital platforms in disaster communication, especially for Chimanimani community. What does this mean for them when they are not actually on these platforms? So initially, my understanding of Cyclone Idai was shaped through a digital perspective. I was abroad. I was observing it at a distance. And as I analyzed media content, these tweets, posts, the shared videos, what struck me the most was the absence of the voices and lived experiences of the affected people. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of Cyclone, I did not expect the people affected to participate because they're more engaged in saving their lives, saving other people. But afterwards, their voices were largely not online. So I wanted to understand what narratives they would also share if they would have the opportunity to access this digital platform.
Wonderful. So in your paper, you focus specifically on or kind of contesting like the online narratives, but you do so particularly with reference to youth narratives. What is it about youth narratives that were important to you? What do they tell us that other narratives, particularly online narratives, what do they tell us that they don't? What drew you to those?
So what drew me more to the youth narratives, first of all, was the fact that when I observed and followed the discussions on Twitter, that the narratives of the people affected who actually experienced the disaster was largely not online. And what drew me to youth narratives when I was in the area was the creativity and energy in which young people conveyed their observations, their experiences, and their grievances about the disaster and how the disaster response played out in the area. And unlike formal reports or official statements that I had read, they used personal storytelling, artistic expression, and social critique, which actually captured the emotional and social dimensions of the disaster in ways that the online discourse did not bring forward. And especially in Zimbabwe and in rural areas, young people do not have much space to express themselves, to contest authority, as well as to contest official perspectives. So what I found out is that while people online were angry about the handling of the disaster, the youth voices were somehow hopeful. So towards change and improvement of their area, and they articulated their needs for better communication infrastructure in a creative way. They articulated their needs in a very creative way that was not as angry and harsh as online observations. And this, for me, highlighted that in some ways they are also challenging the government, but in their own way. They find they have agency, which many people in urban areas do not think that young people in rural areas do possess that kind of agency.
So how are the youth organized? What did they do to show these hopeful narratives? And also, I suppose the follow-up question to that, are they still producing these kinds of narratives? Is this just an aftermath of Cyclone Idai, or is this something that continues in the present?
So what is actually interesting is that the creative work of the youths in this area actually predates Cyclone Idai. So around 2018, there's a local leader that I actually interviewed when I was in the field. His name is Zed, and he introduced the local youth to the concept of the theater of the oppressed, which is a participatory form of drama that allows communities to explore issues of power, injustice in their area. And so the group embraced this approach, and they had already started to perform at village meetings using theater to address everyday issues in their communities. But when it comes to Cyclone Idai, the youth that I worked with were largely self-organized. In the aftermath of the cyclone, there wasn't a good flow of information. So what brought them together was this shared experience of loss, also of survival, and the determination to have their voices and their stories known beyond what online narratives were. When Cyclone Idai struck, the same youths continued to use their theater to expose inequalities in aid distribution. So now they focus on Cyclone Idai. And they targeted ward meetings, community meetings, where food and relief were being discussed, and their performances became a form of expression and also a subtle form of accountability. So people would know that they have to act in accordance to the good of the society because the young people would also expose them in their theater plays. And after Cyclone Idai, the group didn't fade. It actually evolved. They began focusing on community resilience, and they're still using performance to address conflicts that arise from resource shortages, environmental pressures, and over time they become increasingly independent. Today, many of these youth remain active and they are working closely with Chimani Mani FM, which is a community radio that was established after Cyclone Idai as a response to Cyclone Idai and the lack of communication in the area. What began as a grassroots response to crisis in 2018 has become a sustained youth-led movement, and they're continuing, they're training other young people to continue with the performances in their communities. And also on that note, I would like to acknowledge my research assistant who is from Chimanimani. He played a critical role in connecting me with the local leader of the group and also other members of the group, where I could get a lot of insights into how they organize themselves, what kind of consequences they have in exposing people who do not act in the greater good of the society. So it was through my research assistant that I was able to also gain insights into the inner workings of the group.
Fantastic. It sounds like an incredible movement, and that is getting increasing. The size of their audience is growing from like something that's very community, like in-person based, to something that's now multimedia as well. I suppose, how far is this going to go, or how far has it gone? And what are the barriers for youth who are affected by Cyclone Idai and who are continue to mobilize now through these community responses? What are the barriers for them having their narratives heard in, I suppose, official and online discourses as well? Are they making themselves heard in those areas too?
So that's very interesting question. The youth that have been affected by Cyclone Idai continue to face several barriers to having their voices heard in both official and online discourses. And one major challenge is limited connectivity in rural areas, which makes it difficult for young people to participate in certain conversations online. Also, economic challenges. So Zimbabwe has been struggling financially, and a lot of young people do not have jobs, so they have economic constraints in accessing the digital platforms fully to realize the full potential of digital platforms. So these structural barriers also compounded by a bias, towards urban youth. So young people in cities are more connected and not only to local networks, but also national and global conversations, which makes their voices more visible as opposed to youths in rural areas. But despite these obstacles, the rural youth are finding creative ways to make themselves heard, and through the community radio, they are able to leverage local storytelling. And also they have painted a mural on one of the libraries in the village, just to share their experiences and use different ways to express themselves. So even without the resources that young people in the urban areas have, the young people continue to challenge dominant narratives in their own ways. And I think that these strategies demonstrate that even if they are technologically disadvantaged, also economically, they are shaping how their experiences within and beyond the disaster are understood by their own communities, but also at a national and hopefully at a global level.
I want to ask you more about one of the things you just mentioned, the mural. So obviously you spoke mostly now, and indeed most of your presentation focused on kind of theatrical performance. But this mural also seems really important and really striking as well. Could you tell us just more about this mural? So it's on the painting on the side of a library. How do the mediums of, I suppose, theatrical performance and the mural speak to each other? Do they tell the same or different narratives? And I suppose why as well?
So when we look at the mural, for me, I look at it as a visual and symbolic statement. So unlike the theater performance, it captures this collective memory of the area before the disaster, because in the mural, they deliberately left out the destruction that was caused by the cyclone in the area. So they left out the landslides marks, the rubble, the destruction that the area experienced. And what I really found striking in this mural is the aspiration for a better community, the aspiration to move towards a healthy ecosystem and a community that is better prepared. And like I mentioned, most of the online discussions were towards the lack of preparedness, the lack of communication. And on the mural, they paint an internet booster, so for connectivity. And you could see that this is very important for them, that if communication had been strong in the area, they would have received timely information, they would have acted before the cyclone made landfall, and probably the number of people who would have been affected would have been decreased. So I like that the mural is quite a contrast to online narratives, to the performance, in that it shows these aspirations.
And thinking about those aspirations then, in our current age of global warming, there are several studies that suggest that tropical cyclones in the Western Indian Ocean world and elsewhere, I might add, and we're recording this immediately in the aftermath of Hurricane Melissa in devastated Jamaica. But there's several studies that suggest that cyclones like Idai, hurricanes like Melissa are more likely to be of that kind of magnitude because of global warming, becoming stronger, becoming more frequent. And I guess the logic of that kind of line of thinking is that the likelihood of Zimbabwe being hit by another cyclone of Idai's magnitude, of Melissa's magnitude, for example, in the near future, is increasing. What's going on in Zimbabwe now, I suppose, is the question. Have lessons been learned, I suppose, at official and even online levels? Is Zimbabwe more prepared now, both in official circles and but also in grassroots levels, in places like Chimanimani, given that these aspirations and these memories of 2019 have these youth narratives since 2019 that were beginning to be established even beforehand? Do they have the capacity to enhance preparedness now and I suppose moving forward in our warming world?
So thank you for that. And it's indeed true that with climate change, we are seeing an increased frequency and of different natural events. And of course, this raises an urgent question for Zimbabwe, especially that if another cyclone would happen of the same magnitude as Cyclone Idai, is Zimbabwe prepared? So that's a question that many people have. But what I can say is that since 2019, there have been significant efforts to improve disaster preparedness and communication, both at the official and grassroots levels. And one of the notable developments that I've already mentioned is the establishment of a community radio in Chimanimani, because Chimanimani has been affected before. And this is establishment of Chimanimani FM, which was an initiative supported by different UN organizations and also the government of Zimbabwe. And this station is very vital to the area because this is also where the young people have a dedicated space, and not only for disaster communication, but also sharing local information, which raises awareness on different issues, but also it makes people aware of disaster information and makes disaster communication much easier. And what is effective for me, especially with the local radio, with the community radio, is that it employs the local youth who are instrumental in sharing information. They spread the information much faster, and they are also connected to local NGOs and local community-based organizations. This connection makes communication, especially in the face of disasters, flow much faster and reach the targeted audience, the people who are vulnerable and exposed. And so, in my continued interaction with people in the field, they say that it has become a hub for creative education. And it's so important, especially for disaster communication, to be conveyed in different formats. And creative ways actually help people to understand the information much more, other than just a simple text or an announcement that can make people panic when a disaster is approaching. So this continued discussion and making the topic of disasters part of the everyday conversations, I think it's a very good step towards making the place much more resilient when other disasters approach in the near future.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful paper. I'm so thrilled that you discussed it here for our podcast audience. It's a wonderful paper that you presented at the speaker series as well. I'm going to close with one question which I ask all our guests. What are you working on now? I suppose you're still working on this paper somewhat, but maybe you can give a kind of a broader flavor of your doctoral research. Yeah.
So, I'm currently working on finalizing this paper, like you rightly said. It is part of my PhD, and it is going to form, the final chapter of my PhD. And I'm also working on the framework just to tie everything, all my work together. And I hopefully submit and defend very soon. So that's the immediate work that I'm currently focusing on. And I hope that we can have also future collaborations with the Indian Ocean World Center, maybe to look much more into the historical outlook of cyclones in Zimbabwe. That could be an interesting flavor to my PhD.
Certainly something I'll be very interested in. And yeah, as I said to you privately, but also at the beginning of this podcast, it's been wonderful having you here at the IWC. Love to have you back here again sometime in the future. Thank you so much for discussing your research with us, both in the speaker series and here, two of our kind of activities. I really appreciate you kind of tailoring it for two audiences. It's a significant effort to do that. So really, really appreciate it. And more broadly, just your contributions to kind of our research environment here. It's been great having you. So thank you. And we'll certainly miss you too.
I would definitely miss this place, and I'll miss working and talking to you every day. Thank you very much for having me and hosting me.
You're welcome. Before we close, I do need to give some couple more thanks as well. I need to thank Sofia O'Reilly, who is producing this podcast. And I'd like to thank, of course, you, the listener, for streaming or downloading wherever you are. Once again, my name is Philip Gooding, and this has been the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership, Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.